The lights inside the Fairmont Royal York had a way of making everyone look like they belonged there. Polished and permanent. Like portraits hung on walls that had never known change. Isabel Marsh had attended a dozen charity galas in that ballroom over the years. Always beside her husband. Always half a step behind, while he worked the room with his easy shoulders and easier smile. She knew every chandelier, every gilded column, every corridor, where the acoustics shifted just enough to carry whispers from 20 feet away. She wasn't supposed to be there that night. Her name had been quietly removed from the guest list 3 weeks earlier. In the same week, her husband's publicist sent a personal note to the Toronto Star suggesting that the separation had been mutual, peaceful, and ultimately about two people growing in different directions. Isabel had read it over coffee on a Tuesday morning and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not grief, not rage, but the particular vertigo of watching someone else narrate your life. She came anyway. The invitation had been issued before everything fell apart, and technically it still bore her name. She'd arrived 20 minutes into cocktail hour, before the formal program began, when the room was still warm and fluid and nobody had taken their seats. That's when she saw them. Connor stood near the north bar, one hand resting on the small of the woman's back with the proprietary ease of someone who had stopped pretending. The woman, Isabel had learned her name was Farah. Farah Okafor, art consultant, 31 years old, laughed at something Connor said, tilting her head in a way that suggested she'd been practicing how she laughed around him. She wore a dress the color of champagne, and her whole posture said arrival. Not guest, arrival. Connor looked up and found Isabel across the room. The expression that moved through his face lasted less than 2 seconds before he controlled it. But she had spent 11 years studying his face and she caught it anyway. Not guilt, not surprise. Relief. The specific, terrible relief of a man who had been waiting for a confrontation to finally begin so it could eventually end. Isabel raised her water glass very slightly in his direction. Then she turned and walked back into the crowd. She had not come to make a scene. She had come because the Chalmers Foundation had been her client before it was ever his. And she intended everyone in that room to remember it. Isabel Marsh had built her consulting practice the same way she built everything. Carefully, patiently, without asking anyone for permission. The firm was called Marsh Strategy, which her husband had always said was too plain a name for what she actually did. She helped cultural institutions raise money, restructure their donor relationships, redesign the stories they told about themselves. She was not flashy work, not the kind that got profiled in Toronto Life, but it was precise and it lasted. She and Connor Ashby had met at a fundraising gala, not unlike the Fairmont one, 14 years earlier, when they were both starting out. He had been working in communications and she had just launched the firm on a shoestring and a referral. It was charming and genuinely funny in the way that takes real intelligence. And when he said he believed in what she was trying to build, she had made the mistake of believing him. For the first 6 years they were good. Not perfect. No working couple in their late 20s was. But genuinely good. She designed the strategy, he handled the relationships. He became the face clients saw at dinners and conferences, and those long afternoons when donors needed to feel heard rather than processed. She did the architecture underneath, the structure that held it all up. At some point, the architecture became invisible. It happened slowly, the way structural damage happens inside walls you can't see. Clients started calling Connor first. Connor started describing their work, in the first-person singular at industry events. Connor started sitting at the head of the table in client meetings, not because anyone had designated him there, but because he had simply moved toward it and nobody had stopped him. Including Isabel, who had assumed the substance of the work was enough to make the hierarchy clear. She was working on the Westmount Museum campaign, the morning she found out. A Tuesday in February, still dark at 7 a.m., coffee going cold at her elbow because she kept forgetting to drink it. A calendar notification had pushed through Connor's iPad, which was sitting on the kitchen table because he'd left without it. She moved to dismiss the notification without reading it. Then she read it. Dinner, Farah, Auberge du Pommier, 7:30. Not work, bring the thing I left at yours. She sat down. She was already sitting, but she sat down differently, with the full weight of understanding pressing from above. She didn't go through the rest of his iPad. She didn't search for more. She had spent enough years working with human psychology in fundraising to know that one clear signal was more reliable than 100 ambiguous ones, and this had been clear. Connor came home at 11:15 that night, smelling like the warm interior of a restaurant and some other woman's perfume, which has a particular quality, not aggressive, just present, like a fact. that a wife recognizes in the dark without effort. Isabel was sitting in the kitchen with her laptop open and the lights on. She asked him, simply and directly, how long? He answered the same way, 6 months. He said the word, the way you say a number that's already been decided. Not confessing, recalibrating. He said he'd been trying to find the right time. He said it in a voice she didn't recognize, lighter than his usual voice, as if he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down. And he told her the thing that would matter in the months ahead. He said he intended to be fair about the firm. He said a lot of things after that, but Isabel heard that one sentence and understood what kind of fair he meant. Not generous. Strategic. The notice came through his lawyer the following week, while Isabel was in a client meeting at the Art Gallery of Ontario. A formal statement of intent to dissolve the partnership and divide assets including client relationships, intellectual property developed jointly, and the ongoing contracts of 6 active campaigns. His lawyer was named Prescott, out of a Bay Street firm that charged rates Isabel had seen in invoices when Connor had used them for corporate work. He had retained Prescott before she'd found the calendar notification. The timing wasn't coincidental. The timing was the plan. That same week, Toronto Life published a brief column in their society section. Marsh Ashby split, inside one of the city's most stylish partnerships. The piece quoted Connor at length on the difficulty of separating personal and professional lives, on the natural evolution of creative partnerships, on his own ambitions as a connector and cultural entrepreneur, a phrase Isabel had never heard him use before, which told her it had been given to him. He came across as gracious, forward-looking, and just sad enough to be sympathetic. Isabel's name appeared twice, both times as context. She called her closest friend, Nina, who had known them both since before Marsh Strategy existed, and who would therefore be very careful about what she said, which meant Isabel would be able to read the truth in whatever Nina didn't say. Did you know? Isabel asked. A pause of about 4 seconds. Then Nina said, there were things I wasn't sure about. That was enough. The social texture of their world shifted in the way that it does when a couple separates, and nobody is quite ready to choose sides out loud. Isabel attended a workshop on arts leadership, and felt the careful, considerate distance that people maintain when they are monitoring a situation before committing. She heard through a board contact that Connor had already begun describing himself to prospective clients as having led the firm's strategy work. She saw on LinkedIn that 2 of their junior staff had accepted invitations to a launch event for something called Ashby Communications Group, a name that had apparently been registered 4 months earlier. 4 months. She looked at the registration date for a long moment. 4 months before the calendar notification. 7 months before his lawyer's letter. He had been planning this longer than the affair itself. Her own lawyer was a woman named Bernadette Chow, who operated out of a small office above a Vietnamese restaurant on Spadina, and who had a reputation for being methodical in a way that unnerved people who expected settlement lawyers to be louder. Bernadette walked Isabel through the documents Connor's side had produced and said, almost conversationally, that he was claiming co-authorship of every major strategy developed under the Marsh Strategy name. Co-authorship, Isabel repeated. His position is that his client relationships were generative. That without his ability to establish trust with key donors, your strategies would never have been implemented. Isabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he means that without someone to smile at clients while I did the work wouldn't have been done. Bernadette looked at her over her reading glasses. That's roughly the argument, yes. What Bernadette didn't say, but what Isabel heard anyway. The argument was not entirely without merit in the eyes of a court that would weigh relational capital against technical expertise, and not necessarily arrive at her answer. She needed to think differently. She needed to think the way she thought about campaigns, about the story underneath the story. The woman Bernadette suggested was named Cécile Fontaine, and she was not a publicist in the traditional sense. She worked specifically on professional reputation in high-stakes disputes and had the kind of record that didn't appear on a public website. Bernadette had used her twice for other clients. She described Cécile as someone who reads a situation the way a cardiologist reads an ECG. Not what it looks like, but what it's actually doing. Isabel met her on a Thursday afternoon in a coffee shop on Bloor that was too loud for anyone to overhear. Cécile was perhaps 60, unhurried, and asked 2 questions before she asked anything else. Did Isabel want Connor back, and did she want revenge? Isabel said no to the first. She paused on the second. Then she said she wanted the record corrected. She wanted the people who had spent years benefiting from her work to know whose work it actually was. Cécile nodded. She said that was better than revenge. She said revenge made the aggrieved party look unstable. And instability was the narrative Connor's side would try to construct. Then, she said the question isn't what you've built, it's whether the right people know who built it. Over the following weeks, Cecile began with the documentation. Isabel had, without particularly intending to, kept everything. Original strategy documents with version histories, email threads where client feedback had been directed to her specifically, drafts with track changes that showed her voice at every turn, invoices where her name appeared as the signatory, and, most critically, a series of internal assessments she had written for 2 major clients that Connor had presented in meetings as our thinking, and that bore Isabel's name in the document metadata. The metadata had not been something either of them had thought much about at the time. It was quite significant now. Cecile also asked about the origin of their major client relationships. This was the same question Isabel's analysis of Connor had eventually led her to, and the answer was the same one she had quietly known and quietly ignored for years. The Chalmers Foundation had come through a board member Isabel had met at a conference she'd spoken at in 2016. The Westmount Museum had followed a published piece she'd written on capital campaign structures in 2018. The Harborfront Partnership had been a referral from a colleague of hers from graduate school. Connor had been introduced to each of these clients by Isabel, and he had maintained and deepened those relationships through dinners and calls, and the kind of attentive personal contact that she had never been good at because she was always working. She had built the doors. He had walked through them and eventually, quietly, taken the door handles with him. That's not partnership, Cecile said. That's leverage. She told Isabel she needed visibility, not as a statement, but as a correction. She needed to show the sector who she actually was, when she wasn't standing beside someone who stood in front of her. She had turned down a speaking invitation from the Ontario Nonprofit Network earlier that year, because the timing had conflicted with a client deliverable. She had declined a profile request from a sector publication, because Connor had said it might look self-promotional. Those decisions, Cecile said, had not been accidental. They had been managed. Isabel began accepting the invitations that were still open. She gave a keynote in Ottawa about long-form donor strategy, that a room of 200 people in the sector attended, and she said the word, I, more times in that 50-minute talk, than she probably had in 5 years of client presentations. She wrote a piece for the Philanthropist Journal about the structural problems with partnership models in small consulting firms, and did not mention Connor's name once, because she didn't have to. Anyone who knew them could read the geography. The sector noticed. Not explosively. It moved the way professional reputation moves, in careful, deliberate currents, but it moved. Then Cecile found something. She had been doing what she described as environmental research, which meant talking to people in adjacent circles in the casual, purposeful way she had clearly been doing for decades. What she found was not about Connor specifically. It was about Farah. Farah Okafor had a pattern. Before Connor, there had been a married gallery director in Montreal, who had left his wife, dissolved a decade-long creative partnership, and hired Farah as his programming consultant the following year. For him, a married architect in Vancouver who had separated from his firm's co-founder, also his wife, and subsequently brought Farah on as a development consultant. Both men had something Farah wanted to move toward, an established network, an institutional credibility, a platform she could access from the inside. Cecile laid this out without drama, as if she were presenting a project timeline. She's not a homewrecker in the casual sense, Cecile said. She identifies infrastructure and finds a way to be adjacent to the people who run it, and Connor's infrastructure is mine, Isabel said. Was yours. She's repositioning herself as the person who connects him to the cultural sector. The same role you held for 11 years. Isabel was quiet for a moment, then she asked how long before Farah found the infrastructure wanting. Cecile considered this. She said probably when the original credibility ran out. It became clear that the platform Connor had to offer was derivative, not generative. That the clients who had stayed with Marsh Strategy had stayed for specific reasons that Connor could charm, but not replicate, she said. By the time that happens, you'll have built something new, and the damage will be his to manage. The Chalmers Foundation Gala was Cecile's recommendation, not Isabel's instinct. Isabel's instinct had been to stay away, to protect herself from the specific humiliation of watching Connor work a room she had spent years building, now with Farah on his arm, now with her own former clients treating them as the natural unit. Cecile's counter-argument was simple. The Chalmers Foundation's major donor campaign had been Isabel's design. The gala venue had been her suggestion 2 years earlier. Several board members had sent her private messages, since the split, expressing what they carefully described as concern for the relationship with Marsh's strategy, by which they meant her. She had more legitimate claim to that room than he did. Showing up was not theater, it was fact-stating. She got into the car on that Friday evening in October, and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been performing composure for months, and has become quite skilled at it. Fairmont's valet line moved slowly. She sat in the back seat and looked at the side of her own face in the dark window, and thought that she looked, somehow, more like herself than she had in a long time. Connor was near the bar. She had clocked him within 40 seconds of arriving, not because she was looking, but because 11 years of proximity makes a person's silhouette recognizable from across a large room, even when you're no longer looking for it. She didn't go to him. She went, instead, to the Chalmers Foundation's executive director, a woman named Harriet, who had emailed Isabel twice in the past month, and both times been very warm. Harriet greeted her with the specific warmth of someone who had made a decision about where her loyalty sat, and was glad of a chance to demonstrate it quietly. The evening moved. Isabel spoke to clients, to board members, to a young fundraiser who had heard her Ottawa keynote, and wanted to talk about entering consulting. She was present in a way she had not allowed herself to be at these events for years. Because for years the event had been about Connor's network maintenance, and she had been there to support the effort, rather than to occupy her own space. She was in a conversation about capital campaign benchmarks, with 2 board members when the program began, and the foundation's outgoing chair took the microphone to offer remarks. Isabel had written that chair's donor impact narrative 2 years earlier, a document that had been instrumental in the campaign's overperformance. The chair mentioned it, not at length, not theatrically. She said, in the context of thanking the strategic partners who had shaped the campaign, that the framework they'd used had come from Isabel Marsh, whose capacity analysis had changed how the board thought about their ceiling. She said Isabel was here tonight and she wanted to say thank you directly. The applause was not enormous. This was not that kind of crowd, and it was not that kind of moment. But it was real, and it came from people who understood what was being recognized, and it was Isabel's name alone that had been said. She stood, she nodded. She sat down. Across the room, Connor stood with his hands in his pockets and his champagne glass held by the stem, and an expression she had not seen on his face in years. It was not anger. It was the look of a man recalibrating something he thought he had already finished calculating. He made his way to her during the break before dinner, while the crowd was still moving, when it would look casual rather than deliberate. He said her name. She turned. He looked well, she told him. Said she did too, with a flatness that acknowledged he wasn't saying it as a compliment. He said the chair's remarks were generous. She said they were accurate. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly that he hoped she knew he had never intended to take anything that was hers. She said, "You registered a competing firm while we were still together. You retained a lawyer before I knew the marriage was ending. You told clients you led the strategy work for campaigns I designed alone. At what point, exactly, did your intentions become more real than your actions?" He didn't answer. He shifted his weight slightly, the way he always did when he didn't have a prepared response, and needed a moment to construct one. She said she wasn't interested in a long conversation. She said Bernadette would have a revised settlement position to Prescott by end of the following week. Then she said, as a kind of factual aside rather than an accusation, that Farah Okafor had done this before. That the gallery director in Montreal might be worth a call, if Connor was building something and wanted to understand what he was building with. Farah appeared at Connor's shoulder, her champagne glass fresh, her expression composed. She looked at Isabel with the careful politeness of someone trying to seem indifferent and not quite achieving it. Isabel looked back. She had spent some time imagining this moment and had worried it would feel enormous. It felt, instead, manageable. Farah was a woman who had made choices. So had Connor. So had Isabel. The difference was that Isabel's choices had built something real, and she had the version history to prove it. She said it was good to see them both. Then she went to find Harriet, because Harriet had mentioned that a new board member was interested in a full campaign refresh and Isabel had thoughts. The dinner was good, the wine was better than last year's. She stayed until 10:30, said genuine goodbyes to people who were genuinely glad she had come, and walked out through the Fairmont's lobby into the cold October air of King Street. Her phone had 3 messages, one from Nina, asking how it had gone, one from Bernadette, with a note that Connor's team had reached out that afternoon proposing to move from their original 50% claim to something in the range of 35, which Bernadette described as movement, and one from Cecile, which said only, "I heard. Well done." Isabel stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the CN Tower framing itself against the dark above the buildings. She had lived in this city her whole adult life and still felt, occasionally, that it was larger than she had fully understood. There were entire sectors of it she had shaped, campaigns she had designed that had funded programs that would outlast anything personal about this year. The Harborfront Capital Project, the Westmount expansion, the Chalmers Endowment that would support arts education in underserved neighborhoods for 20 years. Connor's name was on none of those. His name appeared in the relationship documentation, in the emails where he had followed up and confirmed and rescheduled. He had been useful and real in those roles. She had never doubted that, even at her worst moments of anger. What he had not been was the architect. She got into the cab. She looked at Nina's message and typed back, "It went fine. More than fine. And then because that wasn't quite enough, I remembered who I was in there." The settlement took another 2 months. Bernadette was patient and systematic, and in the end, thorough. Connor's claims to intellectual property were reduced substantially when Cecile's documentation, the metadata, the version histories, the original correspondence, was presented in mediation. He received a percentage of ongoing contract revenue for an 18-month transition period, which was reasonable and which Isabel agreed to, because it was faster than a trial and she had work to do. Farah's name never appeared in the legal documents. She was by that point listed on Ashby Communications Group's website as Senior Consultant, Creative Strategy, a title Isabel recognized as one she had applied to a staff position she'd tried to fill in 2019 before the budget hadn't supported it. Farah had installed herself into the gap. She was welcome to it. Ashby Communications Group did modest work in its first year. Connor won 2 small contracts through relationships he'd genuinely built, and Isabel heard he was good at those meetings, because he always had been. The work that required structural expertise, the long-form thinking, the campaign architecture, the capacity analysis, those pieces were harder to produce without her, and clients who had known Marsh strategy for years began to notice the difference. Isabel didn't track it closely. She was busy. In the spring, she was approached by a foundation board in Vancouver about a 3-year strategic consulting relationship, the largest single contract in Marsh Strategy's history, coming through a referral from the Ottawa keynote. She accepted it, expanded her team by 2, and moved to a new office in a building she had admired from the street for years, without ever quite thinking she would work there. Her name was on the door, plain as she'd always kept it. Some things she had learned which she didn't say aloud much, but which had become structural in the way she moved through her days. That she had spent 11 years, making herself smaller in the presence of someone who used her largeness as a resource. That this was not entirely his fault. That she had permitted it in the way that someone permits a slow leak. Not catastrophically, not even consciously, but consistently, until one morning the whole wall was damp. That the correction was not a single night at the Fairmont, not a settlement agreement, not a good keynote. The correction was cumulative. It was every meeting where she said, "I developed this framework," instead of, "We've found that." It was keeping the metadata. It was answering her phone when Cecile called and actually listening. It was understanding, finally, the things she had spent 11 years designing around without naming. You cannot build a lasting structure on a foundation that belongs to someone else's ambition. You can only build on your own. She bent over her desk on a Tuesday morning, coffee cooling at her elbow as it always had, and began working on something new. A framework for a Montreal museum that had an impossible timeline and a donor list that needed a complete reimagining. The kind of problem she had always been best at, the kind that kept her up not from worry, but from the particular urgency of a mind that has found its right material. Outside the window, the city moved through itself in its ordinary way, confident and indifferent, and full of the work she had already changed, and had not yet started.